So good morning, and yeah, thank you to the organisers for the invitation. When Dan invited me to come and reminisce on the old days, I already made me feel very old. And then I saw Renen's presentation, and yes, that time has passed very quickly. So I was asked to sort of reflect a little bit on where we came from and what we were thinking when that journey started and what we've gone through in large part to the work done by all of you. And just give a few thoughts on maybe where we're going in the next or in the near future. And so I think my overriding thought when I think back to those days of when we started talking about putting what we now call digital measures into trials, I remember this feeling of excitement, and I think we were also coming on the wave of things like large-scale sequencing, high-throughput screening. There was a real wave around that time of new technologies coming into science and just opening whole new horizons. You know, these were not incremental, these were really step changes, and in some cases really creating entire new fields. And I think this is very much what we thought digital was going to be for clinical trials as well. And for me personally, you know, what I think back to at that time, so there's an author and poet, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, so she's writes a lot about stereotypes and how that influences our thinking. And I remember at the time, you know, some of those early conversations, and it really struck me that this is exactly what we do in clinical trials. You know, we summarize health often as a single variable, and we don't really even have much choice of what those variables are. You know, we had a very small menu. And I think this, as I say, this idea of a new technology coming into clinical trials and opening up these horizons, I think this was very much what was driving my excitement, you know, that we could write a more rich story of what we could capture inside of a clinical trial and perhaps tell patient stories better and make better decisions. And this was really something that, as I say, drove a huge wave of excitement. But our initial steps were, let's say, naive. And I'm not shaming anybody here because this is actually from me. And Lorcan isn't here, so he's not going to get upset. But I think this was a very typical study design at the time. You know, we led with a very engineering mindset of really thinking about what could we measure, you know, and we were really, you know, loading up patients with different sensors and you know, making very complex protocols. So even in this small study, I think we had 6 different sensors, and you know, we were very excited about what all of that could tell us. And I think there was definitely a few years where we continued in this kind of vein. And for me, kind of really one of the turning points when I think back to it was actually the work that Verily put forward to the FDA a few years ago, because on the surface of it, it was a really excellent proposal. You know, I mean, the technology is obviously very nice. You know, it's a very mature, very easy to use technology. You know, their algorithmic work is excellent. You know, the accuracy is really good. You know, they did everything right in terms of how they engage with regulators. You know, they had those early conversations. And as we all know, that LOI was rejected because it was not considered to be measuring something that is meaningful to patients. And I think this result took a lot of us by surprise. But when you look back, you know, hindsight is always 20/20. I think it was really a culmination of a lot of messaging from regulators that was becoming ever more insistent that it's not about what you could measure, it's really about what you should measure. And you need to have a very strong rationale about why are you measuring this thing? Why does a change in this thing constitute a meaningful change, not just what is a meaningful change statistically defined. And as I say, this was really for me about a convergence of a lot of different pressures, you know, and as we all know, regulators are rarely leading in these kind of things, but they were definitely a big part of that conversation. And we now see real consensus across all the stakeholders that it really is about what we should measure, and the way that we develop those measures also needs to be done in a way that is very considerate of that lived experience. And I think that convergence has really brought us to where we are now, and I think is really starting to set us up for some exciting times in the next few years. And I think for me also, I feel like as we've already heard, we're at a stage where a lot of the pieces are now in place, right? In terms of we have well-accepted frameworks for how you present this evidence, the processes with which you approach regulators are becoming more mature, stakeholder groups are becoming more organized and better able to advocate for the people that they are representing. And equally, regulators are helping us out. They've created things like PFDD, whether that's being run by regulators themselves or by advocacy groups. These are just 3 examples, which I think we're probably all familiar with, but this idea of articulating what a meaningful measure would be and how to take that evidence forward and how to organize it has become much more mature over the last few years. And so I think we're aware of that we should be measuring something meaningful, but we also have those practical tools in place. And we're starting to see the results of that, right? I mean, obviously the work from this group, that concept model of showing us why walking is so central to so many lived experiences and to so many disease journeys has become more and more incredibly well accepted, and I think is a great example of how to do this and how to build these models. And on the left, we have an example from our own work, which we co-created with Rett patients and their caregivers to understand how breathing dysfunction is part of their lived experience. And again, seeing these models being published, being put in the public domain, and being the basis of new measurement tools, I think is an incredibly important step, that this is becoming just part of the process. This is becoming standard. And again, I think the work that Mobilise-D has done has really contributed to making those processes standardized and to creating those methodologies and helping us all understand actually how to put patient centricity into practice. But obviously we're not quite there yet. So I want to talk a little bit about where we're going in the future, or where I sort of feel we still need to make a few steps. And obviously there's a lot of things that we could be concentrating on. And I think creating these concept models is obviously incredibly important. But there are, we still need to actually put it into practice, or put it into creating those measures. And I think one thing that always strikes me is that there isn't a concept model out there that doesn't talk about environment and adaptation and contextual information. But that's typically something that we are ignoring. And I think over the last few years, we maybe haven't really been in a position to measure those things. But now with the increasing entry into the market of multi-sensor technologies, so increasing processing power and things like this, we're starting to get to the point where we really can start to measure context, and we can start moving beyond things like bouts, but really starting to add additional layers on top of that to really start to pick out those important moments and compare them over time. And the other thing I feel like we still need to be pushing on is, of course, that regulatory process. It's just incredibly important that we are interacting with regulators and helping them work out what their pathways are. On the left here is an example of a letter of intent that we have just submitted to the FDA on our work on breathing dysfunction. And again, it's still not as smooth as you would like. You still need to decide whether it's a biomarker or a COA. Why does that matter? It matters because you have to have a format for the form, but in terms of what you're measuring, it's a technicality. And I think it's, as I say, we need to continue to interact with regulators to help them create resources, create pathways. And I think there is willingness there, but we have to be brave in putting our work out there and interacting with them and helping move that work forward. So I just want to finish on, again, this now, by this point, incredibly famous picture. But it really is important, and I really do want to thank you all for the work that you've done, because, again, being brave, putting it out there, interacting with regulators, I feel like the processes, the pathways that have been forged through this project really are going to create a lasting legacy in this field. And so I really do want to thank you all. And I'm excited to see what happens in the next couple of years. So with that, thank you very much, and hopefully I can meet you all later today.